So memory is the retention of information over time. Think about encoding and storage and retrieval. These are the basic processes required for memory. Failure can happen in any of these processes. When you're thinking about memory, though, you do want to think about these three different stages: the encoding, the storage, and the retrieval. Short-term memory is retention of information for about 30 seconds without rehearsal of the information. Individuals can retain information longer using rehearsal. If you were trying to remember something like several digits and you would use rehearsal and you would repeat them, maybe even out loud, that's going to be rehearsal. Long-term memory is going to be relatively permanent and longer lasting. And then related to these is what they call working memory. And this area is where individuals manipulate and assemble information. This is where you make decisions, do problem solving, and comprehend language. And as you can probably guess, better working memory, you're going to be better at reading, math, problem solving. Working memory is linked to many aspects of children's development, which makes sense because this is going to be the area where you're processing information. And then there's Figure 3 shows a visual of working memory if you would like to look through this. This is Badalay's, it's his working memory model. So you've probably seen this maybe in another class at some point. Briefly on this, working memory, it's kind of like a mental workbench where a great deal of the information processing is carried out. It consists of three main components to it: phonological loop, Vizio spatial memory, and the central executive. Input from the sensory memory, what's going on out here, goes into the phonological loop, where information about speech is stored, maybe even rehearsed a little bit. The Vizio spatial working memory, this is where the visual and spatial information is going to be held. So this could be imagery, for example, what you see. Working memory is limited capacity system. So the information that's stored there is only stored there for a brief amount of time. Working memory will interact with long-term memory using information from the long-term memory. And some of the things that are going on in the working memory will be transferred to the long-term memory. Baddeley also added what's called an episodic buffer component to explain how information about the timing and location of memories gets stored. So essentially, you have information from the outside. It either goes to the Vizio spatial or the phonological loop. Is it speech? Is it something that you're looking at? Those go to the central executive, and then the central executive works with the long-term memory, and they go back and forth. On constructing memories, so there's schema theory, the idea that people mold memories to fit information that already exists in their mind. And then kind of going along with this is schemas, mental frameworks that organize concepts and information. One of the examples the textbook gives is the idea of if you took a person to watch a baseball game and maybe they've never seen a baseball game before, they have a schema that they can apply. Maybe they've seen a soccer match, and so they're able to apply this schema that they have to what's going on, but they are going to, according to schema theory, they're going to kind of twist things a little bit into, they might add some things about soccer into this baseball game because they have a memory of soccer, but they don't necessarily have a memory of baseball. What they're seeing for this first time, they're seeing this for the first time, and so they're going to apply concepts they already have, even if they don't quite fit. With the schemas, they influence the way that people encode, make inferences, and how they retrieve information. And often gaps in the memories are going to be filled when they are trying to be retrieved. So you're filling in some gaps in your memories. Unlike, we talked about a computer metaphor earlier, unlike the way computers operate, when we think about the past, we actively reconstruct it. So our minds will distort events as we are trying to encode and store the impressions of it. Essentially, we don't record things as they happened. We reconstruct the past, and our mind can distort those memories. On the fuzzy trace theory, it states that memory is best understood with two types of representations, the verbatim and the gist. Verbatim is where you would remember things essentially word for word, but gist is like, I have a pretty good idea of what happened. I know the central idea of what that experience or that information was. Young children try to store and retrieve verbatim traces, and then during elementary school years, they start to go more towards this gist way of storing things. Gist contributes more to improved memory and reasoning because fuzzy traces are more enduring and less likely to be forgotten than verbatim traces. So if you're trying to remember everything that happened word for word, verbatim, it's going to be hard to do because there's too much going on. But if you're like, I just kind of remember the gist, you're able to store more information by doing that. And they also talk a little bit about expertise with memories, that our abilities to remember new information about something depends on what we already know. So experts, they have acquired extensive knowledge about a particular content area, so they're going to have better memory for that area than someone that's not an expert. I mean, this is obvious. And that knowledge is going to influence what they notice and how they organize and then represent and then interpret the information. And this will affect how they are able to remember and reason and solve problems. And so in this example, what they did is they took children who were chess experts. These were kids who were 10 to 11 years old, and they pitted them against college students, and they did a couple of memory tasks. So one memory task was just remembering random numbers. And college students were able to do significantly better than the 10 to 11-year-olds. So good job. However, these 10, 11-year-olds, when they asked them, they had them remember locations of chess pieces on the chessboard. The experts, even though they were 10 or 11, were able to outperform the college students on that task. So what they're getting at there is the idea that expertise can, even in sometimes it's more important than how old you are in some certain aspects. But on just regular tasks, maybe that you are on even footing with, the older person is going to do better than the 10 or 11-year-old. Okay, memory in infancy, childhood, and adolescence. For 3 months old, they show the early stages of memory development. They definitely can remember the perceptual motor information. We talked about that before. You have implicit memory and explicit memory. Implicit is you don't necessarily remember where you learned it, but you just know how to do it. And then explicit memories are going to be conscious memories, facts, experiences. Infants do not show explicit memory until about 6 months of age, according to the textbook. So you have implicit pretty much from the get-go. Explicit is something you actually have to develop. Related to this is the idea of childhood amnesia. So most people cannot remember anything for the first 3 years of their life. And this is called either childhood or infantile amnesia. And what they think this is the immaturity of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. And so most young infants' conscious memories appear to be fragile and short-lived. By the end of the second year, though, long-term memory is much more substantial and reliable. And so we do have an image for this. The memory and how long, so 6 months old, maybe just a day, 9 months old, it's up to a month. So there's a huge increase just right there. And then a 20-month-old can remember things for possibly 12 months. Leif has it's sometimes an unfortunate memory span. He can remember things for an extremely long time. So he has passed this mark. So he does remember things for 12 months. As an example, we had a dog that died when he was 2, and so he's 3 now. And for quite a long time, just randomly out of nowhere, he would be like, "Where's Splenda?" It's like, oof, Splenda was my dog. I had Splenda for, I think, 14 or 15 years. So I might go several days where I don't ever think about Splenda, and then all of a sudden it's, "Where's Splenda?" It's like, oh, it's like a punch in the gut. We cremate our dogs, and so we have them in a box. And so every once in a while, the other day, again, this was a year ago, just the other day, Leif wakes up, and the very first thing he says to me is, "Splenda died. She's in the box." I'm like, "Yeah, Leif, she did. Thanks for the memories." Anyways, the point of all that is that, yes, their memories are quite good by the time they get to 2 or 3 years of age. But related to this idea of childhood amnesia, he's not going to remember these things when he grows up. When he gets into middle and late, he probably will not remember Splenda. And then, yes, memory improves considerably after infancy. They can remember a bunch if you give them cues and prompts. And then they're also getting more knowledge at this time, too. And they're starting to use that idea of gist more instead of the verbatim. There's also going to be changes in their memory span and the uses of strategy. So this is the part on memory span. At about 2, they can only remember about 2 to 3 digits, somewhere in there. And then once they get up to 12, actually about 10, they're getting close to about 6. So you can see this substantial increase, and then it kind of levels out. At about 10 to 12, it starts to kind of slow down a little bit. There are certain strategies that when we start to get into childhood that can benefit their long-term retention of memory. If they're able to organize information when they encode it, that helps their memory. Memory also benefits from what they call elaboration, which involves engaging in a more extensive processing of the information. You actually have to think about it a little bit. They're not just passive observers. You have to think about something to remember it. Also, creating mental imagery is another way to improve memory. But the research shows that using imagery to remember verbal information works better with older children compared to younger children. Some more teaching strategies to encourage children to understand the material that needs to be remembered. So you have to tell them, this is something you're going to have to remember. You actually have to be very explicit and tell them that. And there's a couple other things that have been proposed. Repeat with variation of the instructional information and link early and often. So the more times you can expose them to the same information but in different ways, the better chance they'll have to remember it. And then embed memory relevant language when instructing children. Talk a little bit about reconstructive memory with childhoods. They're talking about eyewitnesses, children as eyewitnesses. There are several things that can influence accuracy of their memories, and there are age differences. So some kids, younger kids, are way more susceptible than older kids, but there are individual differences. So some older kids can be even really susceptible to, let's call it accidental persuasion. What can happen is through interviewing techniques, it can produce substantial distortion in children's reports about highly salient events. Basically, eyewitness testimony, it's not very good with adults either, just as a side note, but it is really poor with children. Just by asking a question like, I think one of the studies they talk about the idea that they were at Disney World and they asked the kids, was Bugs Bunny there? And for some kids, just by mentioning Bugs Bunny, it creates a memory. The child is like, oh yeah, I remember Bugs Bunny being there. Bugs Bunny was not at Disney World. But just by asking the question in that way, you're able to implant a memory. So the idea that when they are doing these types of interviews, you don't want to ask leading questions. If you ask a question like, was this person there? There's potentially, you're creating that memory. A better question would be, who was there? Not, was this person there? Memory in adolescence, it does increase. Obviously, working memory increases, and the improvements in adolescence and young adulthood appear to be due to shifts in neural functioning in specific brain regions. And so they had some tasks, some research in working memory. And if you want to look at this is on figure 9, and they show the mean scores for each age group. And obviously you can see that each one of them goes up as age goes up. And so it even increases from 16 to 24. There's an increase in a lot of these areas, essentially showing that even from 16 to 24, there are changes in the brain and in neural functionings, and you actually get a better memory during that time as well. You've probably heard this before, the idea that the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until the age of 25, and so that's probably related to this idea of working memory too. That's it on memory. Next slides, we'll get into thinking.